I never meant to become family to something that wasn't supposed to exist. I meant, at 22 and thin as a radio wire, to fix the busted repeater on Red Butte and get back to my thermos of coffee before the wind took the taste from it. January 1974 had other plans. The storm came like someone throwing a blanket over the world and forgetting to tuck the edges. Snow drummed against the windshield in crooked beats, the kind that turns headlights into fog. The radio in my truck was all static and warmth. I turned the knob until a voice came through, some farmhouse, a sermon, something human, and it kept me company while the road narrowed to white. I was half a mind to turn around when I saw the small shape slumped by the road, dark against the snow, little breaths making halos in the wind. I stopped because I couldn't not stop. That's the plain truth. Rescue was what I signed up for in the Forest Service, save the lost, mend the broken. But what crawled up into my arms that night was neither deer, nor man, nor any creature I'd been taught to name. It was small, about the size of a Labrador, with a coat the color of new cedar and eyes that took the light like a child's. Its leg hung wrong, a pale arc beneath the fur. I could see my reflection in its eyes, young, tired, and, God help me, hands that knew how to splint a bone and make tea. I worked quickly, more from habit than heroics, pulled my jacket over it like a blanket, wrapped the leg with a strip of scarf, drove with the heater full and my hands numb until the truck smelled like a mix of wet fur and antifreeze. The cabin was a two-room thing with a wood stove and a sagging chair. It smelled like cedar, old books, and the last of summer. Naming is how you close a distance. I had no right to name what I didn't understand, but when it blinked sleep-heavy and nuzzled the sleeve of my flannel, Little Bit was the only thing that fit. The name felt ridiculous and right. It made the thing in front of me less a question and more a presence at the table. The first nights were all practicalities: heat, water, a place to lay the injured leg where it wouldn't swell more. I fed it small things I'd kept around the cabin: soft oatmeal, warmed peaches from a jar, the leftover broth from a rabbit I'd skinned the previous fall. I learned that it liked bland food and the rhythm of a spoon. It learned to trust me by degrees. Trust was given in tiny increments. A blink longer each morning, a breath that didn't jerk away when I reached for it, a paw that found my knee like a child asking a question with its palms. One evening, after I'd rigged a splint from fiberglass tape and coat hangers, good hands, bad for hospitals, apparently useful for mountain improvisation, I put on a record. It felt like the civilized thing to do, to remind whatever this was that human voices existed that weren't the wind. The needle fell, and from the battered turntable came the soft, honest voice of Carole King. It was a thin luxury, the album cover creased with winter and use. "You've got a friend," she sang, her voice curving through the cabin like a blanket that asks no questions. Little Bit sat close to the wood stove, head tilted as if the song were itself a kind of weather and it wished to learn the forecast. When the chorus came, the creature's eyes closed, and it breathed in the rhythm of the music like someone practicing speech. I watched it, felt a ridiculous swelling in my chest, and realized that I was crying without sound. Those 2 weeks, and a year in the way memory stacks time, were a private country. We built small routines because humans make meaning from routine, and because creatures without words learn patterns in the absence of grammar. Morning, stove, coffee, patchwork of bread and stew. Noon, sun on the porch where little dust motes would dance over the creature's fur. Night, a lantern, the record player, and sometimes a pair of hands that would find the same patch behind its ear until both of us fell asleep to the quiet ticks of the radiator. Little Bit never spoke in words then, not anything I could chart on a linguist's page. It made sounds, low hummings, something like a coo when it found comfort, a deep rumble when it was confused. Once, when I picked at the splint to check for swelling, the creature made a sound that could almost be called laughter, an animal sound, a human one folded into itself. It brought me coffee once by half dipping a paw into the thermos and then dropping it at my feet. It was a clumsy, filthy gift, and I kept it on the stove until the last drop warmed my fingers. There was a moral shape to every choice that winter. The cabin had rules: no outsiders, no questions, and certainly no telling. I was single then, reckless in small ways, and felt a selfishness I kept at the edges of my good deeds. You can't take it to a zoo, the thought said when I considered the options, and a more particular, honest thought followed: you can't keep it. Even then I knew there were things a man could do out of kindness that would bruise the people he loved if he never told them. That knowledge sat in my rib cage like a splinter. The storm broke the morning I had planned to release it. Sun came after heavy clouds, the kind that makes the world look washed and honest. Littlebit walked, awkward and brave, along the porch and pressed its wet nose to the new snow, as if smelling the place where it had been born. I walked it into the grove I'd found a month earlier, a holler of spruce and pine ringed by rocks the color of old teeth. There was a soft hollow where snow was thinner, a place where I could see the tracks of rabbits and bear and the ordinary progress of wild things. We walked in silence. It paused at the edge of the trees and turned back to me once, a long look that broke every funny little denial I had stacked up like firewood. I wanted to promise it a life I couldn't ensure. The creature, for lack of a better word, looked at me as if to ask whether we were done or beginning. I put my hand, rational human hand, a thing made for maps and wrenches, on its head. The fur was softer than I imagined, but not unlike a sack of warm wheat. I couldn't leave you, I said then, to the trees and the thin winter air, to whoever had to hear the truth. The creature made a soft sound, some syllable of gratitude, I'd later learn, and sidled into the grove like it had 1,000 times before. I left a jar of peaches under an upturned root, a line of tin cans and bread, and one of my own shirts near the hollow so it would have my smell. It felt like a promise more than a plan. I drove home with the truck quiet, with the radio tuned, but the song from the night before wrapped around me like a secret. The moral ledger felt balanced for a moment. I was wrong. I never told anyone. Who do you tell that you found something that looks like a legend, and then, for reasons that don't fit in a sentence, set it free? I told no one, even when the guilt warmed in me like a fever. I put the experience into pockets where grief and joy coexisted. A worn thermos, a record smeared with fingerprints, an old bit of fur I tucked into a spare glove. Months became years. A small life grew up around the secret. In 1976, I met Sarah. She was the kind of woman who'd learned how to set things straight with small, efficient motions. Her hammer, a map folded with attention, her laugh that made the kitchen feel like an engine. We met at a volunteer meeting for trail maintenance. She argued about switchbacks in a way that made me stop paying attention to the work and start paying attention to her hands. She liked practical things and hated waste. She liked people who showed up. She liked a man who could change a tire and fix the heat. We married in late spring with a small crowd and a pie that looked like a personal victory. Our life was not made of enormous cinematic gestures. It was wood stacked for winter, letters exchanged with my sister in town, a lullaby hummed into a mattress at 3 a.m. Emma came first, in 1982, a quiet thing with brown lashes and my jawline. Jake followed in 1986, all knees and questions. We had a house that needed painting and a dog that shed like snowfall. I taught them to track the trail markers, to respect the swell of creek water, to listen to the forest. The secret, though, did not vanish. It lived in the small thefts of time I took. Longer routes home, a trip to Red Butte that I'd never truly finished, an odd expense for bait and canned goods on the grocery list. It lived in the way I touched the thermos in the garage when no one looked, or the soft pressure behind my eyes when I heard a tree break in the distance. Sarah saw pieces, a tuft of cedar-colored fur on my jacket once. She asked once, casual in the way partners test one another, and I told her a lie that was kinder than truth. "Maybe bird," I said, and she smiled. But I could feel the thing in her chest that had learned to ask questions anyway. I learned to be competent at secrets. Men in the mountains practice a certain compartmentalization. It's useful when you don't want to think about what you can't fix. I became a steward of two household economies, the ordinary bills and the hidden ledger of what I'd seen and once touched. The world around us changed in slow and obvious ways. Logging roads gnawed at hills I'd run as a kid. Ranchers pushed farther into the valleys because money said it was right. Fires came hotter, and the spring snowpacks got skinnier. People joked about the old stories, the ones my grandfather told of things in the woods that kept to themselves. We joked too sometimes, in the way you joke about things you are afraid to name. It was a decade of small losses. A nest disappeared one year into a logging scar. A trout stream ran low in late summer, and the kids watched its bed like a place of grieving. At night, when the children were small and our life hummed with the domestic noise of dishes and homework, I would sit and think of the grove where I had left a shirt and a jar of peaches. I imagined, sometimes too vividly, a small red-furred thing growing into its shoulders, learning to listen to birds, learning the pattern of human footsteps in the snow, and deciding whether to fear them. The doubt in me hardened into devotion. For years I convinced myself that what I had done was the right measure of kindness. For years I sat in the quiet parts of my life and wondered whether kindness must always come with a cost. There were nights when my old patrol routes led me past places where the snow had been disturbed in odd arcs, like the wake of something heavy moving with careful feet. Once, I found a cedar-smooth stick carved into a pattern like a child's attempt at a compass. I kept the stick. I kept 1,000 small ghosts of memory to myself. The children grew. Emma learned to read maps the way her mother did, tracing contour lines with a patience that made a 20-year-old grief seem childish. Jake learned to shoot, and then, for a time, forgot why he wanted to. They both learned the cadence of our household, the fixed points of bath time and supper. They learned to cross the forest that edged our property without making the hush and fear of a child that had stumbled upon something private. On the surface, we were the same family as the others in our little town. We traded tools with our neighbors. We showed up for potlucks. I ran the radio for the Forest Service for a while, then did a stint repairing repeaters in winter and maintaining trails in summer. I knew the men who believed in facts and measurements, the ones who would put a stake in the ground and call it truth. They were good men, direct, loud, and unafraid to say what they meant. I felt a soft embarrassment among them, like someone with a hand in a pocket that held a secret about someone else's child. And so life layered on itself. Years had a way of softening edges until I nearly convinced myself I had properly buried the wildness of those 2 weeks. The memory became a kind of litany I would say on nights I feared I was letting something important go. You did the right thing. You did the only thing you could. The forest is older than men and will keep its own. Then, 20 years from the storm, came the knock. I remember the house that night like a painting, the light in the hallway a tired yellow, the clock over the stove insisting it was almost 9, Sarah clearing plates, the kids watching some dull program in the living room where the TV acted as a warm white glow. November in 1994 had that thin cold that makes your joints remember their age. I'd been in the garage, cataloging a box of old tools I'd intended to give away. My hands smelled like oil and cedar shavings. The radio on the bench was tuned into a station that never said much, just a murmur of weather and the occasional country ballad. There were 3 knocks. I'll never forget them. Deliberate, slow, the kind you give when you want someone to know you know their name. Not the random rap of kids or a neighbor drunk and loud. These were measured, as if the one knocking allowed each beat to say, I am here, I remember. My heart did something stupid like leap and then fall into a careful, older rhythm. I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, telling myself it was a neighbor, Dale maybe with a busted truck, or Sheriff Anderson looking for a lost dog. I called into the house, I'll get it, in the way that sounds braver when you don't know what the house will open onto. I walked to the door and opened it. There are moments that rearrange the furniture of your memory. For me, the porch that night will always be too small for everything that happened there. A figure filled the doorway that I recognized the way you recognize the sound of your own name across a crowded room. It was taller than anything human should be, broad as a barn door and packed with muscle. Its fur was the color of the first light at dawn, not the bright red of a fox, but the heavy, muted cedar of the thing I had left in a grove. It carried itself with a weight and a gentleness that didn't ask permission. Up close, too close to believe, I saw its face as if someone had carved a stern, thoughtful man out of wood and then covered him with living warmth. The eyes were the same eyes as that January night, but older, keen, like a hunter who had learned patience. When it spoke, its voice was a low thing, rough around the edges, words chosen as if testing them for sound. "Patrick," it said. The syllable landed like proof. The name came out of a mouth not made for it and landed like a practiced lesson. The thing that had been Little Bit had not forgotten. I froze between the impulse to slam the door and the memory of peaches in a jar. The doorway framed a kind of impossibility that felt, at that moment, like the only honest thing in the world. It was not before its time to end this part. For a second I stood, and the world narrowed to the space between my breath and the creature's. I wanted to say that everything made sense. The long years, the tuft of cedar under my coat, the way the wind had once shifted and left me a map of a life I hadn't meant to make. I wanted to keep my hands to myself, to take care, to remember that what I had done once may have had consequences I couldn't foresee. The creature stepped forward, and the porch creaked under the weight of what a single decision can cause. Its voice came again, slow and precise, as if choosing a letter for a second stab at the alphabet. "You saved me," it said, in a syntax that made my skin feel childish. It was not accusation. It was a ledger opened with a hand that did not forget debts. Something in me answered, as though years of small silences were finally given a sentence. I felt my chest open like a door. "I remember," I heard myself say. The words were small, nothing compared to what the next 20 minutes would demand. There was more to come. Questions to be asked, reasons to be given, secrets to be weighed against family and law. The porchlight threw shadows like small, taking things, and the cold that had been only an excuse now felt like a presence. The thing that had once been small sat back on its haunches in a human shape, and for a breath, the world looked like the time between two storms. If you like long, strange stories like this, consider subscribing. There are more like it. I stood there for a long second after the knock, the way a man might stand in a doorway deciding whether to go inside again or close the house forever. Inside, the sound of the television was domestic and trivial. The kids' laughter, the clink of dishes, Sarah humming a tune I'd learned to love. Outside, the thing that had been a legend and a boy, and I realized with a sudden and tight sense of old responsibility, my own strange cousin in the ledger of my life. It introduced itself in ways that should be impossible, and then made them plausible. Little Bit. No, Little Bit was a name he had once had and worn like a child's sweater. Spoke not with perfect English, but with a cadence that suggested a language shaped by long listening. He'd learned from travelers, from the way hunters sworn to secrecy cursed into the night, from the soft human music I'd once played on a turntable. "You kept the shirt," he said, words that were simple but true, as if he'd been here before with sharp memory. "You left food. You left friend." Each choice to make a sentence sounded like something carved out of thought, then sanded into shape. He stepped close enough that I could see flecks of frost in the fur along his jaw. "You saved me," it said, words that were simple but true, as if he'd been here before with sharp memory. "You left food. You left friend."
Each choice to make a sentence sounded like something carved out of thought, then sanded into shape. He stepped close enough that I could see flecks of frost in the fur along his jaw.
I asked the only question I could think of. Old habit, curiosity, a man trying on disbelief like a coat. "Where's your family?" I heard how small that sounded. The wind filled the silence that followed. He looked away, and the posture of whatever his kind called grief folded into him. "We small," he said, "not many. Elders sick. Mourning." He stopped on that name like it was a delicate thing to hold aloud. "With baby. Read. Need winter. Need shelter." There was no theatrical threat in his voice, no sharp demand. It was a request. It was a plea. He had come 20 years after a small favor to ask a far larger one. The logic of the world, which likes its problems solved on paper, did not know how to weigh the cost of kindness in a house with a mortgage and 2 children who needed to see their father at supper. I could feel how the ledger of my life tilted. Old debts do that, stack themselves where you can't ignore them. This man-sized thing stood on my porch and looked like a man, sounded like broken English and a memory, and asked something dangerous and tender. Could I shelter him and his? Could I keep a secret I had kept 20 years ago and amplify it into a sanctuary? There was 1,000 ways to answer. The obvious ones were arithmetic, the questions of neighbor and law, Sheriff Anderson, who liked tidy facts, Dale, who liked the light of his own opinion. The harder answers were human. What I owe to my wife and children, what I owe to a creature that might not have another future. Sarah came to the door during that silence, hair in a loose knot, flour on her cheek from the pie she'd been finishing. She stopped when she saw the figure, and every small thing in the room rearranged to fit the new image of the man in front of us. "Patrick," she said, incredulous, and then softer, "Who is?" The creature lowered its head, as if to salute her with the respect of someone in front of someone important. It was the wrong word, but it was the only thing I had in the moment. "Little bit," I said, because names are anchors, and because even now I could not give up the ledger without writing at least one line of truth into the margin. Sarah's face was a book I could read and not. She was astonished, furious, frightened, each emotion a page turned too quickly to understand. She collected herself like someone who knew it was better to move with intention than to be swept by whatever tide had come on the porch. "You hid this?" she said, and the question was small and dangerous. "It came tonight," I said. They need shelter. I didn't expect." She surveyed Little Bit as if cataloging a new, inconvenient piece of furniture. She had a way of deciding by looking that made me defenseless. "How many?" she asked. The question was precise and household-minded. "3," the creature said. "Elder, mourning, read, winter worse, roads not safe. You help?" There it was. The spine of the story, the thing that had come to test the strength of my earlier kindness. It was not a theoretical problem. It was a small family in human form asking to spend a season in our house. The ledger of rightness tilted again. The responsibility to protect the people I loved pushed against the obligation to protect a species I'd once saved. Inside, Emma called for more popcorn. Jake laughed at a joke he'd heard 100 times. The ordinary, loving sounds of family life felt suddenly miraculous and fragile. I felt, in that instant, very much like the small, frightened boy who had huddled against a radio and cradled a creature with a broken leg. If you have ever been asked to carry another's weight, you know how the bones answer. The answer I gave then was not heroic so much as necessary. I had built a life on small, honest things: loyalty, showing up, fixing what creaks. The thing on my porch asked me to do one of those things again. "We can't keep them in the house," I said, because the truth of living with children was that privacy is a finite resource, and a shed Insulated and hidden is a different sort of boundary than the front room of a kitchen. Littlebit looked toward the line of trees, then back to me. Shed, he said. The word had a careful approval to it, like a child being pointed toward the correct path at the library. Plans began in small movements, whispered exchanges, Sarah's hands folding a shirt like a map, my body easing into a competence I thought had gone soft with time. We spoke in short sentences and longer silences, balled up decisions like bandages and held them until the hurt stung less. I promised things I had no right to promise, that I would keep them hidden, that if it came to the law, I would shield them in whatever small ways I could. I did not yet understand the ripple of that promise. It sounded noble in the dim light of the porch and dangerous in the full light of the days to come. But the thing that had once been a pup and now was the size of a man was at my threshold, and I remembered peaches under a root and my own hands warming to a small, trusting body. The creature bowed its head in a way that was almost sermon-like and said, with a clarity that made my throat lock with old gratitude, "You saved me. Now we ask you to guard ours." The night swallowed the rest of the sentence. The sound of the TV and the thump of a sitcom laughed through the thin glass. I stood in a doorway that connected decades, a young man who had done a small kindness, and a middle-aged one about to compound that kindness into a risk with a price. The ledger's margins were full. I was about to sign my name again. There was more to plan, more to fear, more to weigh. Coalitions of neighbors, the suspicious sheriff, the underside of gossip in small towns. But first, we had to make space. The shed was an old beacon, half sunken by the woodpile, just large enough for a man and definitely large enough for what would need to be kept there. It needed insulation, food left away from curious raccoons, a creaky latch changed to something quieter. It needed a family to be brave in the way families are asked to be brave, together and without fuss, because the price of dramatic bravery is too high for quiet lives. Sarah stood with the light behind her and, for a heartbeat, looked like a queen deciding whether to grant a subject an audience. She looked at me and then at Littlebit. Her eyes were sharp and wet, and the combine of hurt I'd been avoiding for 2 decades crept out. "Are you sure?" she asked me, as if the single syllable could hold the volumes of my secret. I didn't answer at first. I thought of the 2-week winter, of peaches in the snow, and Carole King's voice like some domestic clergy. I thought of a creature's breath against my sleeve, and the simplicity of a child trusting you. I thought of a boy on a porch, and a future I could not keep to myself. "Yeah," I said finally. "Yeah, I'm sure." The word felt like stepping off a ledge into a river I hoped would have water. We had a night to prepare. The thing outside shifted and, in the thin cold, looked like a statue come alive. I made coffee that burned and tasted like an oath. Sarah moved without melodrama, packing jars, bottles, a thick blanket she insisted on bringing despite my protests. And for the first time since I'd married her, I saw a kind of courage I hadn't anticipated. She folded a child's sweater and pressed it into the creature's hands without asking where it had come from. She did not like me less for the secret. She adjusted the world to add it. There were so many details. What to put in the shed to make it tolerable, where to hide footprints, what noise would cause a child to go running with questions. I thought of Dale Morrison, our neighbor, who loved a good spectacle and had a nose for news. I thought of Sheriff Anderson and his tidy facts. I thought of my children's faces and how they would bear the consequence of our hush. The plan was not a map so much as a string of practicalities. Insulation under tarps, food stowed high in paint cans, a quiet latch, a radio muffled under old blankets so voices would be human and less dangerous. It was a plan made by people who knew how to fix things but were suddenly working against the unknown. It was a plan that smelled of cedar shavings and coffee and the faint air of fear. Outside, the creature watched the house with the patience of one who has kept long accounts. The forest hummed like it had chosen to keep its own counsel. I could not tell whether my heart was beating at the pace of fear or hope. Maybe both. We moved into the tasks with the kind of focus people have when the simple, reparable things of life are the only things they know how to do. Sarah hammered. I insulated. The kids slept through it all, ignorant of the ledger I was signing with my hands. Little Bit was a different name now, if he answered to it at all, moved like someone learning a new instrument. He watched the hands that mended wood as if cataloging a craft he'd never needed before. The shed would become a kingdom of small mercies if we did it right. It would be a place of cooking with a kerosene lamp, of hair brushed with fingers that must learn restraint, of night sounds translated into meaning. It would be a place where a man would make himself small for the sake of a larger kindness. The first part of this new arrangement was the simplest and the cruelest, a promise we made to protect beings who could not plead in a language our neighbors would understand. We closed doors not because we were ashamed, but because the world outside us had a way of punching holes in the things we loved. That night, standing with the small mountain wind pressing its cold into the porch light, I folded the world into two acts. One had already occurred: storm, rescue, release. And it had been private and sweet. The other was beginning: hospitality that would demand courage, secrecy, and a kind of family reckoning I'd delayed for 20 years. I did not know then how many people would smell the change in the air. I did not know that a neighbor's loose word would begin to curl into rumor, that a sheriff's curiosity would sharpen like a knife. I did not know that the forest itself would pick sides by sound and tide. I only knew what I had always known when something impossible stood in front of me. Some debts must be repaid, and some kindnesses ennoble the person who gives them and complicate the life they meant to protect. The first night of our winter plan was a chorus of practicalities and small heroic acts. We took turns keeping watch, muffled the radio, and I showed the creature, Little Bit had no better name in the moment, the small rituals of a house. We fed it leftovers in tin cups, found ways to hang tarps so the wind would not carry the shape of something inside, and I went to sleep with my hands still smelling of wood and my mind full of ledger entries I could not erase. When the house finally settled, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and listened to the night. The moon slid between pines, painting long, honest lines across the yard. I felt the weight of the promise like a stone in my pocket. I thought of peaches in the snow, of a younger man who had named a thing he could not keep. I thought of the knock that had started all this again, of a voice that had said the thing I had once done had not been forgotten. There was a long road ahead. There would be stories to tell and stories to hide, years to live with the cost of a kindness that kept expanding like ripples on a lake. There would be people who would call us foolish, and some who would call us saints. Mostly, there would be the small, unglamorous work of making a life that could hold another life in it without breaking. For now, the house slept, the shed hummed with a quiet heat, and the thing that had once been a small creature and had now returned with a family to ask for shelter breathed through the wall like a close, secret friend. I stood there in the dark and felt the balance of the world tip with the gentle certainty that some debts are not paid on a porch in a single night, but that when they are repaid, the world remembers in small, private ways. The knock had been the beginning of an account opened 20 years ago and finally collected. The rest of the ledger, Dale's suspicion, Sheriff Anderson's patrols, Sarah's choices, and the children's bewilderment, had not yet written itself. I had kept one secret for 2 decades. Now I was about to keep a larger one. I shut the door and went back to sleep with the sound of fur breathing through the wall, and in the morning we would begin to write the rest. Morning arrived soft and gray, the moon folding itself back into a pale promise, and the yard looking smaller for having held such a giant the night before. The house kept its ordinary sounds, the kettle clicking off, the kids' voices in the living room, but everything inside me felt like it had been moved a few inches to the left. You hold a secret and your life tilts. You learn the new center of gravity slowly, like a man finding his footing on a plank. We started with the small human things. Food first, sustenance that would make the shed less like a trap and more like a place where life could continue. Canning jars, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, things that kept without having to be fussed with. Sarah arranged the pantry like an architect, stacking calories, making pathways for hands that might not have the same grip she did. She taught me, without lecture, that preparation is a kind of prayer. Littlebit handled the movements of the house the way someone learns a new tune by listening. He watched, he mimicked, he practiced. He held a plate the way a person learns to hold a child, careful, fingers splayed for balance, eyes constant. Morning, whose name seemed luminous when Littlebit said it, moved more quietly. Her fur caught the light in a way that made her look like a woman in a shawl in some old photograph. She was younger than I had expected. Her face still kept the softness of a creature not yet hardened by long winters. Reed, the baby, was a thing of tight, hurried motions and curiosity, fingers that found coat hems, eyes that tracked my hands, a laugh like a small branch snapping underfoot. Elder Ash arrived the next day as rain stitched the sky together. He was not a small man with a cane. He was a presence that filled a doorway the way mountains fill a horizon. Where Littlebit's fur had been the color of dawn, Elder Ash's pelage carried the shadow of many winters, grays threaded through it like the rings of an old tree. He moved slowly, with deliberation, and looked at everything like a scholar taking notes. He did not speak right away in our tongues. He crouched on the far side of the shed and made sounds, low, sonorous tones that seemed to rub against the wooden beams and make them remember. Littlebit translated sparingly, a habit we kept. He would give us the sense of what was said rather than attempt to be literal. It kept their language a mystery and their thoughts dignified. "He says thanks," Littlebit murmured, fingers finding the edge of a crate as if checking the weight of the world. "He says we travel far. He says thanks for shelter." Elder Ash lifted a hand then, a slow, graceful motion, and for the first time I heard a voice that was not translated. It was a rumble, an old song in human register, and something beyond it. It made me feel like the shed had been chosen to be a chapel for a brief while. Over the next weeks, routine became the scaffolding on which a delicate life could be built. We fed them. We tried to give them privacy that still allowed us to sleep. Littlebit learned quickly about the noise children make when they ask questions, and how to turn away without seeming rude. Morning taught Reed to hush when it needed to be quiet, the way a mother teaches any child the secret language of survival. Reed, being a child, learned the house faster than the grown ones. He found the hollow where sunlight slipped in and made it his throne. When the weather turned cruel, and it did, Montana doesn't do small winters, we wrapped the shed in the same kind of careful deceit you use when you tuck a child into bed and tell it dragons only visit other houses. Tarps held ice at bay. Old blankets muffled the sound of a stove. We converted an old kerosene lantern into a soft, safe light. We were making a home in the language we knew how to speak. Nails, warmth, food, and a few rules. Elder Ash sat by the lamp some nights and told stories. He did not do so in English. He did them in a long cadence of sounds, punctuated by sighs and gestures. Littlebit would pause in his work and translate the essential bones. A name, a place, the moral of the story. The translations were short, an economy of sense that left room for motion and feeling. The stories they told were not made to entertain. They were memory work, a kind of oral map meant to keep a people from losing the way. One night, Elder Ash told us about the first hollow, and the story sat in the shed like a warm, large animal. He says once there was a hollow that sang, Littlebit translated, eyes flicking between us and the fire like a man rehearsing bad news. Hollow gave food to the small, hid the weak. Men came, and men made noise loud. Hollow closed. We remember it. We watch for halls that sing again. Elder Ash's hands moved with the story, tracing an unseen river, shaping a mound of earth. He spoke of a place where the ground hummed if you listened long enough, where roots grew in patterns that were like hands reaching up. When he spoke, the children of our family would press their faces to the shed window and watch like apprentices, trying to learn the grammar of an ancient land. Sarah would stand by the stove and fold clothes with her mind on 1,000 different things, her face unreadable and at the same time so open that you felt guilty looking elsewhere. Another night, when the storm tapered off and the world smelled of wet hay and cedar, Elder Ash told a different story, one about first contact with humans. "He says there was a time when men were not many," Little Bit said quietly. "They came quiet at first, then loud. We learned not to stand under their light. We learned to watch from the shadow. Some of us, we touched them once. They took things. We learned to take less." Elder Ash's voice was like a ledger balanced on a single nail. He was not bitter so much as tired. The story had no villains in the way a modern person writes them. It had decisions and the weight of them. He would pause and look at Sarah, or at me, as if checking whether we understood the shape of the choices his people had made long before we had names for those choices. Those stories were the kind I stored in my bones. They told me things I hadn't known I needed to know, about restraint, about the way memory is passed like a torch from one hand to another, about the cost of changing routes because some place you used to walk is now a shopping center. They gave the Sasquatches a depth that made gossip about monsters in the woods sound childish and cruel. The children adapted the way children always do, by turning the unfamiliar into something familiar. Emma, who by then had the steady calm of a teenager, would slip into the shed with a book and try to read aloud so Reed and the creatures could hear the cadence of our language. Jake, who was getting older and had the kind of nerve that made a boy useful in a crisis, would play games like he was mapping out the yard with his feet. He tried not to look like he was measuring them in any way that could become a problem. We kept secrets the way sailors keep a bilge, with routine and, occasionally, superstition. The fewer people who knew, the cleaner the world seemed to stay. But secrecy in a small town is a poor defense. It breathes rumor like a living thing. I knew this. I'd lived it. Yet, when you are up against a slow extinction of a species whose name your neighbors laugh at, you start to feel that silence is a kind of mercy. Dale Morrison saw them on a clear morning. He was on his way to check fence lines. Dale always had one eye on the road and the other on the next thing he could judge. And he saw a figure move behind the shed in the bitter light. Not a full human, not a deer. Something caught in the corner of his vision like a wrong note. He is the kind of man who sees wrong notes and wants to correct the record. He came to the house with that particular blend of curiosity and certainty that makes small towns run on rumor. "You get a raccoon problem?" he said, at first making light. His hands were full of the sort of bric-a-brac men carry when they want to look harmless, a spool of wire, a thermos. His smile did not reach his eyes. I read him like a man who can balance logbooks. He is a man who likes to put things on paper because once they are marked in ink, they become true. He had seen, sort of, and his mind was not content to sit in gray areas. He preferred the hard lines of accusation, the glow of being the man who knew. "You sure you want to come in?" Sarah said, steady as an anchor. There was nothing to do but play the domestic truth. Dale's eyes went, briefly, to the shed, as if the guilty thing were some half-formed curiosity. He did not linger. Men like him are impatient for stories that fit a simple shape. He left with more suspicion than evidence, and suspicion travels faster than proof. That afternoon, the town was like a hearth that had been poked. Sparks flew. Sheriff Anderson, who took facts personally, was the first to knock. He did not come with thunder. He came with the careful, dry humor of an officer who liked to keep things tidy. He asked about tracks, about missing livestock, about whether we'd seen any odd goings-on. I told him nothing. I told him what a man with a mortgage and 2 kids must tell someone with a badge. That we'd seen nothing, that winter makes houses sound strange. He listened, nodding the way men like to do when they are cataloging a neighbor's sincerity. But there was a thinness to his nods that meant he already had the gears turning. Dale's half-story grew teeth in the weeks that followed. A farmer 2 valleys over swore he'd seen a big one near his water trough. A hunter at the feed store swore he found hair in a trap. Hair he swore looked like cedar, then laughed too loud when the idea was floated. I could feel my life compressing into a narrower channel while the pressure around it built. Elder Ash watched all of this with the same steady patience he watched the fire. He did not flinch when voices rose. He had seen men's voices rise before, and he had a set of stories that taught patience like a trade. But there was a light in his eyes that told me he knew the risk. He told us one more story, late in a week when rain was steady and the porch steps were a slick black. He says they once made a circle, little bit translated. Circle of men. They made fire, big and bright. They burned bones they did not wish to remember. They asked us to be smaller. We did. We moved. Old ones did not move. They died. He let the sentence hang and then bent his head. The sentence did not need translation. None of us wanted to push the moment further with words. The house felt like a room with a single candle. The light keeps the dark from spilling, but it does not change the cold. It was about that time the children started noticing things that were not mere curiosity. Emma found a broken toy on the back porch, one of those cheap plastic whistles Jake had bought last summer. Reed, in his way, had taken a liking to the sound and would try to copy it, pressing his lips to a small shape with the solemnity of someone trying to speak a new sound. The toys were the boundary markers between worlds. Children understand lines better than adults sometimes. They ask about them out loud, feeling the threads. I remember the night Sarah finally knew everything, the way you know the shape of a scar. It was after Sheriff Anderson had come to talk. He'd asked if I'd seen anything, and I'd given him a version of the truth that smelled right but left out the ledger. He left, and the house exhaled in that particular way a house does after a man with official voice walks away. Sarah went into the shed to check something, coincidence or a practical errand, and came out 2 minutes later with a look that stopped me. She had seen morning. She had seen Reed. She had seen Elder Ash. She had come within 3 steps of a life that I had kept private, and the sight of it rearranged her. For a second her face was a map of weather, storm clouds, then the calm after. "Patrick," she said, voice thin. She sat on the porch and folded her hands like a woman about to do a hard thing. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she simply arranged her world so she could look straight at me. I told her everything in the only way I knew how, by walking back through the ledger out loud. The 2-week winter, the grove, the peaches under a root, Little Bit, who had been a frightened thing the size of a dog and had grown into a man the size of a barn. I waited for anger to set in like a bruise. It came in layers. First, her face tightened. Hurt, yes, but then there was the bend of practicality. She asked what other choices I'd considered. She asked, with that clear voice of hers, whether we had any business making this kind of choice behind other people's backs. Her questions were blades, but they were honest blades. They wanted to cut through the undergrowth so we could see plainly the path we were on. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the shed. I followed like a man who knows the truth and wants to witness how it lands on someone he loves. She did not speak when she entered. She sat on an overturned crate and watched Reed with the careful, slow attention of a surgeon. Reed reached out with those little, curious hands and took the hem of her sleeve, as if testing whether it would hold. Sarah let him. She began to hum, the way she did when she cooked, softly, a low line of comfort.
It was a tune she'd hummed before, one that made the kitchen feel steady. Morning watched, alert but not alarmed.
Little Bit had a way of sitting near enough to be present and far enough to give space. After some time, Sarah took her hands and placed them on Morning's fur. Her hands trembled slightly, and then steadied. She looked up at me and said, "They're scared." It was not a condemnation, it was a statement of fact. The simplest of truths shifts the hardest of arguments. She could have left. She could have left me with the secret and gone to a life that didn't require the constant tiptoe of fear. She didn't. Instead, she organized like a woman who knew the value of a good supply list and the value, too, of a soft word. She brought blankets, extra food, a baby sweater that fit Reed perfectly, as if she were tucking in an orphaned niece and not harboring what town rumor would call a monster. That night, she made a decision that would be the hinge on which many small things turned. She would help us get them to safety if it became necessary. She didn't varnish it with heroics. She said it with a flat practicality that made the words feel permanent. "If we're doing this," she said, "we do it together. No one goes it alone." Her choice changed everything. It made the ledger heavier on one side but steadier on the other. There was risk, of course. Sheriff Anderson's curiosity, Dale's gossip, and the small, vicious hunger of rumor. But there was also the fragile beauty of a family choosing to enlarge itself in heart and habit. We tightened the routine. The children learned certain words were off limits, no questions about where Reed went in the morning, no loud games near the shed. We adapted the house to precision, not out of cowardice, but because normalcy protects the tender things. We met in the kitchen at night and planned quiet exits if the worst came. We drew no maps we could stick in a drawer. We talked in gestures and held the plan in our heads like fragile notes. Elder Ash grew quieter as the weeks went on. He slept more. Sometimes he would awake and whisper a phrase in his language, and Little Bit would translate, "Snow remembers," or "The paths are frayed." There was a cadence to his decline that felt like a river settling into a new channel. It didn't startle us, it simply asked for the same attention we gave to every fragile life beneath our roof. One night, with the moon sharp and the stars like pinpricks, Elder Ash called the four of us, Sarah, me, Little Bit, and Morning, into the shed. Reed was asleep in a small corner, and the kerosene lantern threw everything into a honeyed half-light. He lifted his hands and, in a slow, ceremonial way, placed a small bundle into Little Bit's lap. "He asks for songs," Little Bit translated. "He asks to tell the old names before he goes. He says we should remember how to speak them so the land won't forget." So we sat in the small, borrowed chapel and listened while Elder Ash's voice rolled out like a tide. His stories were shorter now, each one a bead on a prayer necklace. He told of a year when the snow lay for 9 months and they walked with their bellies low, trading stories for warmth. He told of a spring when the creeks ran thick with salmon and they danced in the shallows until their feet knew the map of the stones. He told of a time when humans came with gifts, little things like spoons and cloth, and then left fences and machines, a clear line where one sort of generosity had been replaced by another that harvested silence. Little Bit would translate the simple truths. "We had food then," or "We do not forget names," and then fall silent so the meaning could settle into us. Sarah cried quietly once during this telling, not because she felt guilt, but because the weight of a world shifting had the familiar ache of watching a child leave for the first time. I watched her because her face, lit in the shed's light, read the story as if it were a pattern of stars she'd been learning to trace. When Elder Ash's breathing finally thinned into a sleep that did not come to wakefulness again, we wrapped him the way a family might wrap a gentle, cumbersome object. Blankets, bark, the things we had to hand that would not grimace at the touch of fur. Little Bit carved a small notch into a piece of wood, a sign of something between a name and a prayer. They did not call it death so much as changing places. Elder Ash would not travel with them anymore, but his stories would ride ahead like beacons. We held a private rite I still carry like a pocket Bible. It wasn't Christian or anything that could be read in a pew. It was made from the things we were allowed to do together. A song hummed by Sarah, a small piece of bread left under a spruce root by Little Bit as a token, a knot of hair tied to a twig. We left Elder Ash in a hollow where the earth liked to keep warmth a little longer. It was modest and legal. There was no desecration of places that were sacred in any living human culture, and it felt enough. If you have ever stood beside a grave that is small and then felt your heart expand with the size of it, you know what held us together then. After the rite, Little Bit came to my hands and took them in his. He did not say many words. The language at that moment was too large for our tongues. He carved symbols into a small disc and pushed it into my palm. Simple spirals, a hole for string, and a knot that meant I remember. Keeper, he said, and then Little Bit translated, he says you carry, he says we will not forget. That piece of wood stayed with me in my pocket like a warm coal for months. I would press it between my fingers when the town felt too loud. It was one of those small things that tethered me, a private ledger entry turned talisman. The spring we had feared finally nosedived into something dreadful. Dale's curiosity turned into an open accusation. He'd seen morning near the road one dawn, lifting reed like something made of dusk and sun. He told the story at the feed store, and it mushroomed. A line of men gathered at his place like crows around a scent. Sheriff Anderson came with him this time, and he came with a seriousness that looked like rain on the horizon. The town's mood stiffened. People who had nodded at us now cross-examined. There were questions I couldn't answer without confession, and confessions I wasn't ready to make without a way to protect the ones who needed it most. The choices frayed like old rope. There was a tipping point in the form of a loud, stupid thing. A dog got loose and barked in the dark near the shed. Dogs are honest creatures. They make no pretense. Its noise sent every animal in the immediate area into a chorus. A neighbor saw movement in the trees and called his cousin in on the telephone. Within a day, we had men in trucks rolling down our lane with flashlights and the kind of righteous anger that can look very like bravery, but is often just fear dressed up. We had to move. The word move is both blunt and full of mercy. We had a few caches in the high country, places we had used over the years when patrols required me to be away, and I knew routes in the way a barber knows his town. Not all maps were on paper. But to say the word move in any other way beyond narrative is to stray into telling people how to walk with illegality, and I will not do that. The plan we made was not a blueprint. It was a set of choices made by a handful of people who had decided the risk of staying was greater than the risk of leaving. The night we left, snow pinned the world and made the night more forgiving. We worked in silence mostly. The shed was a place of whispered goodbyes. Reed clutched at objects he couldn't take, like a boy with a shoebox of marbles. And morning touched Sarah's cheek the way a woman might touch another woman in a church. No words, only the weight of meaning. There was an intensity to the packing that felt like prayer. Everything had to be measured by how much noise it would make and how much warmth it would lend on a long, cold road. When the trucks came down the lane the next morning, they were not the hunting parties I had imagined when I was younger. They were men with the look of men who wanted to make certainty out of ambiguity. Sheriff Anderson stood in the lead, flashlight making a small, hard world out of whatever he pointed at. I did something then that I have thought about and have not always forgiven myself for. I talked to the sheriff with the slow, careful truth I hoped would comfort him. I showed him tracks of fox and deer, real things that existed, not fabrications.
I offered to help him look in places that would satisfy his curiosity, and kept him busy far enough away that when the others drove past our lane, their headlights saw only the empty road and not the shifting shapes of three creatures moving with the patience of those with no good maps. I do not write this as a confession of skill. I tell it because there were things we had to do to make a heartbreak less brutal.
The sheriff's face was human. He wanted proof instead of pangs, and I gave him 1,000 small, believable things. He grumbled and cursed in a way men do when their pride must be fed. He left with some comfort and a sense that the world had been tidied. While he was distracted, while men in trucks were angling and shouting in a valley 3 miles over, we slipped away in a pre-dawn that smelled like coal smoke and pine. Little Bit led with the quiet surety of someone who had lived by pathfinding his whole life, Morning carrying Reed close, and I walked at the rear because my ribs had the peculiar ache of being the man who had asked these people to put their lives in my care. We did not go fast. We went like people trying not to make a sign that would wake the dead. The forest received them like a patient lover, shadows opening, roots remembering old feet. The path we took was not marked with arrows in a manual. It was a line made by decisions and the kind of stubborn hope that keeps parents awake at night thinking of ways to make places safer for their children. Days later I sat on the porch and watched the sun that had been so pitiless the winter before, and felt like it had been bought with coin I could not pay. The sheriff and his men had come back, and the town had its stories, but the shape of our house was less a prison for rumor now and more a bruise that would fade. Rumors, like bruises, have their own life cycle. Months passed. The seasons, which we are tempted to think of as external, looked inside of us and found new patterns. Little Bits sent word. Simple things scratched into bark and left where I'd promised to look. They had not been attacked. They had found a place that kept them. Reed was growing, that nimble, hungry sort of child who uses the world like test plates. Little Bit's notes were short and plain. Safe, food good, New Creek runs clear. Those words were the kind that make a man sleep easier. Then, one morning in late August, I found something on my porch. It was not wind-borne or a mistake. It was deliberate as a letter. A small wooden disc lay on the doormat, weather-worn and smelling faintly of birch sap. It had a spiral carved into it and a small hole through which some sort of fiber had once been threaded. Next to it was a slender sheet of bark, upon which were scratched symbols that were not English, but made a kind of map in my chest. I picked up the disc in my hands and felt the grain like a pulse. It fit my palm exactly. The spiral had been carved many, many times by a hand that had worked with wood for its life. On the back, in the margin, was a small notch, our notch, the one Little Bit had made when Elder Ash died. It felt like a receipt for something enormous. Inside the bark was a pictograph, strange lines that could be read as a map if you wanted to be legalistic about it, or as a prayer if you were the sort of person who believed the world kept its deaths in small tokens. Little Bit had left it, or someone from their band, as a confirmation. Proof, not for the world, but for us, a private thing, a private return. I kept the disc in my shirt pocket for weeks, turning it over like a palm-sized world. It smelled like the other things in my life. Wood, rain, the faint purr of incense that reads like memory. Sometimes I would take it out and press it to my lips, not in worship, but in gratitude, the human kind that feels like an apology and a benediction at once. We told no one, because there was nothing to tell that would keep them safe. We had been given a private assurance. They had survived the season and they had gone on. The knot in my gut loosened a little. I kept the token in a small box with the thermos that had started the whole thing. The thermos had a dent in it from a time when I'd braved a truck out on Red Butte. The disc had a notch carved by fingers that had carried a man's hands once. The two fit together in my mind like a sentence finally ending. There are small, private rhythms after a big thing happens that the town never sees. You go back to mowing the lawn, to paying bills, to trying to teach your children to be honest and kind. You keep the secret neatly wrapped like something that belongs to the family instead of to the world. There is a sweet ache in having known something that no one else knows. It is heavy and tender in equal measure. The months made other things plain. Reed sent back a small token once more, this time a tiny braid of fur tied through a clean bone. Little Bit had written, in his spare, earnest way, that they had found a stream where the fish were fat and the trees were old in a way they recognized. The carved disc and the braid sat in the same box. They were private receipts for a kindness extended across 20 years and repaid in the quietest form of all: survival. Sometimes I would take Emma or Jake with me in the truck to places that were mundane, feed store, post office, and let them breathe the air of a town that thinks its stories are complete. They would press their faces to the window afterward and ask questions like kids do. Do you think they visit the creek? Do they remember us? I would answer the way parents answer the important questions, with half-truths, with stories, and sometimes with the raw honesty of a man who had kept a secret and paid its price. "What does Reed look like?" Emma asked once, sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that was too hot. I described him the only way I knew how, as a child who preferred a patch of sunlight to a toy, as someone whose laugh made you feel like you had found a stray coin. She smiled in the way a reader smiles at the end of a chapter. Jake, who had bristled with the kind of boy bravado that made the world easy to measure, grew in ways I hadn't expected. He began to talk about the woods with a gentler vocabulary. He would not wear his hunting jacket the same way anymore. It sat on him with less swagger and more respect. Perhaps that was a miracle too, the slow inversion of a boy into a man who carries stories with care. I tell you all of this because the ledger of life is not made of single entries. It is a book with margins full of notes. The carved token was a closing line in one chapter. There were, inevitably, consequences and continuing worry. Townspeople who would never understand, an ongoing need to be vigilant without becoming paranoid. You build a life that holds both the ordinary and the extraordinary at the same time. That is the task of a family. Years later, when the kids are gone and the house hums differently, I still keep that wooden disc in a simple box on the shelf next to the thermos. Sometimes, when the wind decides to mimic the ocean, and the old radio station plays a song that tilts everything with memory, I take the disc out and roll it between my thumb and forefinger. It still smells of birch. We did the right things as we knew them. We also did things that were hard to justify on paper. There is no purity in the ledger of kindness. There is only the staying power of it, the way it asks us for sacrifices and gives us back strange, quiet returns. Little Bit repaid a debt across a lifespan, and the repayment was not money or fanfare, but an asking and a giving back in a season when giving mattered. Sarah and I have spoken often about whether we did the right thing. We argue like older people do, less heat, more consideration. Sometimes we say that if we had the chance to take it all back, we would hesitate. The fear of having endangered our children is real, and it is a weight that sits at night. Other times, sitting on the porch with a thermos and the stack of small wood discs, we say that some choices are not merely about safety, but about the kind of people we want to be. Those conversations are not neat. They are sticky, honest, and often end with us holding hands and listening to the cold breathe through the pines. People ask me, sometimes, whether I ever felt that we were playing God. I say yes, because in a way we were. We had to decide, and decisions about lives are the closest thing to a godly act a small man can manage. But if godliness is measured in how one treats the weak, then our errors and our courage sit together like two old neighbors who have learned to smoke on the same porch. There is no parade for small kindnesses. There is, however, a kind of quiet accumulation. The carved token on my windowsill is proof, not to the world, but to the family that gave them shelter. Someone remembered, someone repaid, and it did not all end in tragedy. That is enough. The ledger closed at different times for different people. Reed grew tall, and at some point his letters came less often, then not at all.
because living in the deep places leaves less to report.
Little Bit visited once more years later. Just a shadowy, patient note left on a bench. A spiral, a notch, a short line that read, in Little Bit's clumsy, human-taught English, "We guard your name." My shoulder aches now where the years have pressed. My hair has gone the same kind of gray that threaded elder ash. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the porch light is a small moon, I take the disc out and tell the story again, not as proof, not as a claim, but as a confession and a memory. I tell it because stories have the strange power to make the past less lonely and the future more bearable. When I think back to that January night, thermos of coffee, a record needle scratching patiently over a groove, the small cedar-colored creature in the road, the thing that strikes me now is not the oddness of the event, but the fact that one small, stupid kindness can grow arms and walk hundreds of miles. That kindness asks for nothing dramatic in return. It asks only for a watch and a willing heart. I keep the carved disc on the windowsill now, where the light can touch it in the morning. Sometimes I take it down and let Emma's children, my grandchildren, God willing, see it and hear the story I have told you. I do not offer it as proof for those who want evidence. I offer it as a moment of accountability, that a choice once made can ripple into lives you had no right to touch, and that sometimes those ripples come back as blessings. There were costs. There always are. We lived years with a risk that sat like a stone in our chest. We answered questions that had no good answers. We learned to sleep and be awake in a world that refused neat endings. But in return, we had moments of such pure human tenderness that they discreetly paid for the fear. Morning's hand on Sarah's sleeve. Reed's laugh. Little Bit's awkward attempt at humming our melodies by the lantern. Elder Ash's stories. The carved disc itself, left like a love note on a doormat. There are sentences I have tried on in my head and then set down, because words are clumsy compared to what we did. We cannot bear the burden of being both saints and sinners. We can be two things at once, people who do wrong and people who try to fix it. Perhaps that is the only honest way to live. If this story moved you, share it and tell us which moment surprised you most.